My bangs are crooked and my robe is loud, so apologies. Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project today. Today I thought I would show you all how I made this peplumed top to go with this pleated skirt that you all seem to have a lot of interest in, this top and this ensemble in general. I think most of the historic look to this really is coming from just wearing panniers underneath this skirt, because I am wearing 18th century style side bag panniers underneath this skirt to hold it out in this distinctive shape. It really is just a pleated skirt. I won't be making another skirt today just because I've done a couple pleated skirts here on the channel before, and we might be making, 18th century skirts, long ones, in the future sometime. I don't know. You never know what could happen. So instead of getting into 18th century pleating patterns for skirts, today I'll be showing you how I add a peplum to my all-in-one sleeve top pattern, and also switch over to a front closure on that. Usually I do a back closure with a back zipper whenever I'm using that bodice. Usually I do back buttons, and people are always asking me how I close the buttons up my back, and the answer is I don't live alone, so I just have someone else finish the last few that I can't reach. But of course this one will be buttoning in the front today, so much easier to get on and off by one's self, so that'll be useful. Let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. Alright, here we are with a random piece of alphanumeric paper that I like to use for drafting, and then my all-in-one sleeve bodice block. I have a card version of this. I use it so often because I just love this all-in-one sleeve bodice block. If you'd like to see how I get the all-in-one sleeve version like this from my normal bodice block, you can see how I do it in this video here. I'll put a video up in a card here that shows how I do that, if you'd like to see how to get to here from the regular bodice block. But I've just done a tracing of that, and I've drawn in my dart here, just the same as it is on the block, and I will go ahead and draw in a new V neckline here in the front. And of course I'm going to need to add on some space to the front here, because I'm going to have these nice big black buttons here with a center front closure, I suppose, as opposed to a closure down the back. So I'm thinking about how much space I want to add here. My buttons are about 1 inch wide, so I'm going to do like 1.25 inches of space here in the front, and then I'll of course need a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on the outside of that as well. So I'm just making sure I have enough space here on the front. I had to add on a little bit of extra paper because I didn't leave myself enough room, but I am just trying to use up scraps of paper here, so, recycling, as it were. So I'm just adding on a full, I think it's like 1 3/4 inches here, is what I added on, yeah, to the center front edge here, so this will no longer be cut on the fold, and I'm just modifying my neckline a little bit more here. I'm making the V a little bit higher. I don't want it to end right at the apex. It kind of was where I had it before, but that's just a little bit too low for me, so I'm bringing it up a little bit here. And now I'm going to adjust the waist dart here and put this into 2 darts in the side. So we'll do a little bit of dart manipulation, slashing and spreading here. So just from the apex I've drawn a line down to one of the waist dart legs, and then I've drawn 2 red lines out to the side there where I want my new darts to be. Again, I'm just thinking, do I have this neckline right? If this is the size of my buttons, how many buttons do I want down the front here? Just making these decisions here during the patterning stage. So I'm just going to draw my seam allowance in red so I can get an idea of where that will be. And I think we're good now. So I can go ahead and cut this out and then do my slashing and spreading for the moving the darts around from the waist to the side. Sorry if I sound a little funny today. I have some flowers here on my desk, which are lovely, but I've been sneezing today, and I think I must be allergic to the pollen in one of these flowers, unfortunately, because I just keep sneezing today, so I'm a bit nasally. Alright, so I'm going to cut up from my waist dart leg up to the apex here, and from my new darts over here on the side, again to the apex, but not through it, so I can have everything hingeable and swingable, so I can swing this waist dart closed, and then tape that shut, and then now I've moved that fullness into these 2 darts over here. And I'm just going to split this fullness between these 2 and make them about the same size. I'm not going to measure it, I'm just going to eyeball it, but I'll just split that difference here, and then tape all this down with some spare paper underneath, of course. Like so. And then I like to fold my darts with the fullness facing towards the waistline basically here. Just is the way darts always, the fullness is supposed to face the center or face down. That's how I was taught, at least. Some people disagree. But I like to fold my darts and then cut them off so I can have the correct shape along the side there. Just cut off any excess paper and tape down anything I need to. And I can go ahead and label this all-in-one sleeve jacket, quote unquote, jacket vest top thing, 2021. And we'll say this is the front, of course. And it's cut too, no longer along the center front fold there, because, of course, the closure's in the front. So we'll cut along the fold for the back. And here I have a tracing of my all-in-one sleeve back pattern. We have very few modifications to make to this. First being that we know can draw on our dart here, but I'm not changing it in any way. But this, instead of having seam allowance along the back like my pattern normally has, I can cut this on the fold. So my center back will be on the fold here when I cut this out. But I can go ahead and label this all-in-one jacket back, cut 1 along the fold. I'm going to make sure that my neckline will match up with the front here, so I'm just grabbing the front pattern, and it came in about a 1/2 inch at the neck there, so I'm just making sure that is the same here for the back, so that that will match up at the shoulder seam when I try and sew them together later. But that's the only change I'm making, is a tiny bit of modification to the neckline, and then cutting off the seam allowance that is usually on my pattern in the back here, because I won't need it for this particular design because the back is cut on the fold this time instead of the front. Hopefully that is all making sense. Go ahead and cut this piece out as well. Alright, so now I can go ahead and start, now I have my front and my back, I can go ahead and start making the peplums, the below the waist portion of this jacket basically. And I'm making this the exact same way, or I'm making this pattern very similar to that yellow jacket. The only difference is that this peplum will be shorter because the peplum is quite long on those, but I'll show you that in a moment. So here I am taking a spare piece of paper that's big enough here, and I'm marking the center front, which is this line here that I'm about to draw in. Of course I have that additional 1 3/4 inch beyond my center front for the kind of placket where the buttons and buttonholes will go, but I'm just marking that on my paper as well, and then I'm grabbing, this is my A-line skirt pattern that I would use to make an A-line skirt or a dress that had an A-line skirt. Normally if this is a dress I would just, cut these out of fabric and sew them together here, but I'm just going to use the top of my A-line skirt pattern to make a peplum pattern here. So I'm lining up the center front of the A-line skirt pattern with that center front indication I just drew on this piece of paper, and then I'm just tracing the top part of my A-line skirt, like so. So this is my center front here. I'm going to need all this extension so that it will match up with my jacket along the top, but I'm just going to make this however long I want my peplum to be. So for my other version here, here's the pattern from my yellow one that I showed in the beginning of this video. That one is 14 inches long, so that's how long that yellow version is. The length gives it a little bit more of an 18th century look as well. But I'm going to go ahead and make this one just a bit shorter, just because I want this to be a little bit less historical looking and a little bit more mid-century looking. So I'm going to make this 9 inches long total, but of course I'm going to lose a 1/2 inch along the hem for seam allowance and a 1/2 inch up at the waist for seam allowance, so this will finish at an 8-inch peplum basically. Like so, just drawing that in. It's just a very short A-line skirt basically, but that's where my center front will be. The only other thing I did the last time for this, when I made the yellow version, was I added a tiny bit of flare right here over the hip as well. You can see beyond the tracing I added a little bit of flare. So I'm just holding my ruler up along the hip curve here of the A-line skirt, or where this was the A-line skirt, and just letting it flare out a little bit more along the side seam so it straightens after the hips basically. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out, and this is basically our front peplum here. That's all I have to do for this, and it will be lined. This whole garment actually will be lined, which I do in a bit of a strange way this time, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. But here is my all-in-one jacket peplum front, basically. And I do end up making a little bit of modification on this later because I forgot to do a step here, but I will show you that when we get to it. Alright, so that's the front peplum, and we can go ahead and do the back in a similar fashion. So again, I'm going to grab some spare paper here. Just grab a piece of that, and I can go ahead and square off a line down the side here that will again serve as our center back. I should have moved that over a little bit, but you'll see what I mean. So this again will be center back, where it will line up with the back pattern there. And again, I'm grabbing my A-line skirt back pattern now. And I will trace the top of that for the peplum for this, but then I will add a couple more changes for this back peplum, the same as I did on the yellow version. So the only change you really need to make if you want it to look just like that yellow one I made, or gold, or whatever color that were, the mustardy gold one, is to make these peplums longer. So again, I'm just doing the same sort of thing I did in the front, just to have this peplum be only 9 inches long instead of 14. Here I'm marking where the back dart comes to once, like if these two pieces were sewn together, and that is where I'm going to put a pleat in here. So I'm going to have 3 pleats total across the back, one at the center front, and then one kind of coming down from each of where the back darts on the bodice are. So where the back dart on the bodice ends, there will be a pleat on the peplum that looks like it's kind of emanating from that dart. Hopefully, again, that makes sense. Just drawing in that curved A-line hem here, just so that the whole thing is 9 inches long. Hopefully that makes some sense. I'll go ahead and cut this out, and then we can add in the fullness for the pleats I'm going to have along this back peplum. So this piece will get wider here in a moment. Alright, so I'm just taping on a little bit of extra here because I didn't leave myself enough room. But I want to have 2 inches added on to the center back here for a total of a 4-inch eventually width pleat back here. So I'm adding 2 inches, which is the width of my ruler, back here past the center back. So this is now my new center back basically. That'll be cut on the fold and eventually will be box pleated. So I can just go ahead and cut off any excess there. And then this line I drew down from where the dart was, see, that'll be pleated like that. This line that I drew down from where the dart is, I'm going to add in my other pleat. So I'm just going to add in 4 inches of width here that eventually will be pleated into another box pleat again. And again, I think these box pleats give it a bit more of a historical, I don't know, touch in the back of this garment. Of course, the fabric that I used for that other, the gold kind of jacquarded taffeta, I think is what they called it. I think they called it a jacquard taffeta from Mood. It has a little bit of stretch in it, which was unfortunate. I wish it was, I didn't have any stretch in it. It would have laid even better. But that fabric looks a bit like more 18th century as well. Of course, not like super accurate, but it has kind of the effect of a jacquard or brocade from the 18th century, and that is again helping with the historical look of the other garment as well. Although today we're going to be using a moire, which they did have what was called watered silk at the time, which is the same sort of stuff, moire fabric back in the 18th century as well. But once this is pleated, you can see how it will fit down. If I hold my dart and my pleats in place, how this will fit to the back of my bodice pattern. So here is my peplum back with those pleats in it. You could do more pleats, you could do deeper pleats, you could do shallower ones, whatever you want, you know? You could do gathering back here instead. You can get creative, as long as, like, you can go as wild as you want, as long as maybe you are willing to make a mock-up or muslin, because, you know, the more changes you make, the more chances there are for you to forget about seam allowance somewhere or something like that. So I always think if I make small modifications like this, no need to make a mock-up, but if I do something wild, then I start thinking, better try this just to make sure I didn't forget or miss any steps. But here is my black moire I'll be using today. This is just a polyester bangaline moire from moodfabrics.com. I used this to make a skirt last year, and here is the leftover bit of fabric after making that skirt that I'll be making this matching little evening jackety top thing out of to match. You can't really see the moire effect on camera much here, but hopefully you'll get a glimpse at it as we move on working with this fabric today. It basically looks like a wood grain pattern on along the surface of the fabric. You will find some moires that are printed to look like moire, but the true moires are created by having a ribbed fabric, like a bangaline or like a thicker taffeta. They press it against itself, like if you have 2 pieces of ribbed fabric against one another and then you press them through rollers in a special way, it will end up creating this moire watered silk, sort of watery wood grain pattern on the surface of the fabric. So it's like more of a physical pattern as opposed to one that's printed on top of the fabric. Here you can get a little bit better look at that. It's a wood grain effect on the surface of the fabric, weirdly enough. But here I am just pinning everything down. I'm pinning the back piece to the fold here, and the back of the peplum also to the fold, and then everything else I just cut out normally, I suppose. I am also going to cut out everything from a black muslin as well, just because I'm going to interline this moire layer with a layer of black muslin, just for structure and in lieu of interfacing this, just because I wasn't sure if the fusible interfacing I have in stock would stick to this polyester moire. So instead of trying to fiddle with that, I decided to just go ahead and flatline all of these pieces with black muslin, because of course cotton is nice and reliable and I know what it's going to do. And then I did also cut out a lining, like a proper lining instead of a flat lining, for this in a rayon, Bemberg rayon lining that I had laying around. Actually, I've had in my stash forever. It's like this dusty purple sort of color lining, so we'll get to that eventually too. But just cutting everything out with those oil slick scissors I bought last year that are very fun, but not very comfortable to use, unfortunately. And you can see how messy my sewing room is. Alright, so one of the modifications I forgot to make on this peplum front is I wanted it to have an angle here so that the peplum doesn't meet exactly or overlap exactly in the front. I want it to have a little bit of an angle to it. So here I am modifying the pattern just a little bit so that the fronts where they, from the waist down, I suppose, have an angle to them. You know what I mean. Like how jackets and vests are. You've seen a jacket or a vest before. I'm going to go ahead, because I've already cut out my moire, I have to cut the moire as well, just the same. And here we can get a look at the yellow version and look inside and see how I had to finish this one. Now this one, the peplum, or like the skirt portion of it, is not lined at all. And of course the skirt here does not come to the same level, I guess, as the fronts, weirdly enough. But the fronts of the bodice are self-lined in the same fabric, and the back is lined with a rayon lining. Then I have my gold buttons on this side, and then machine thread buttonholes on the other side, which today I'm going to go ahead and do a different type of buttonhole, because thread buttonholes do make me quite nervous. So I'm going to do something else today, something that I don't do very often. In fact, I think this is only the second time I've ever done bound buttonholes on an actual sewn garment. So please forgive me that they don't come out perfectly, but we'll see the saga of these buttonholes as we continue. In fact, I'll put on the screen now the minute to skip to if you don't want to see anything about bound buttonholes today. If you're just planning on using thread buttonholes for this kind of a project, feel free to skip to this minute mark, and then you won't have to see me faff around with buttonholes. But here I have marked my buttonholes for, planning on having 5 1-inch large buttons down the front of my garment here. I'm just deciding where I want those buttonholes to sit. Again, I'm just making this up. I don't have any rules that I'm following here. The only thing is that for bound buttonholes, you're supposed to make them the length of the button, which in this case for me is 1 inch, plus the thickness of the button. So this is the length is 1 inch wide, and then the thickness of my button is actually 1/4 of an inch. So I will make my buttonholes 1 1/4 inch long. And then these, because I just wanted 5 buttonholes, it came out that they needed to be 2 1/8 inches apart. And the buttonholes themselves are 1/4 of an inch thick as well, just so I have 1/8 of an inch on either side of lip for the buttonhole. For those of you who've never seen bound buttonholes or see them done before, this should be an exciting adventure for us all, including me. So again, I'm just double checking that I have the right amount of extra width on this. Again, I'm just making this up as I go. I probably could have left a little bit more room. I have like a 1/2 inch of buffer here. I probably could have gone for like a 3/4 of overlap, just because the buttons are so large and the shanks on them are so tall, but whatever. This is all kind of trial and error unless you're used to working with this kind of thing. And as I said, I'm not used to doing this kind of thing. Now, again, like I said, I'm going to flatline all these pieces, so you can see here one of my front peplum pieces pinned all around the edges to a piece of cotton that is cut to the same dimensions. So I'm just going to go ahead and serge around the raw edges of this as a way of flatlining this moire to the cotton muslin. Again, this is black cotton muslin. It's just, cheap muslin that you would use for making mock-ups or things like that. But Mood offers it in black, which is nice of them. So I've ordered quite a lot of it for doing costuming projects, so I had some left over sitting around the room here that I thought I would use for this. The keenest-eyed amongst you will notice that this serger of mine here, this little home serger, I stole it from my mom, actually. Well, I mean, she lives in the same house as me, so I didn't steal it very far. But it doesn't have a blade on it, so it doesn't cut past the edge, so I have to be careful when I'm doing things like this. But there's no blade on this serger just because it broke a long time ago, and I think it was going to cost too much to repair, so we just never have. And alas, I don't really need it. The only thing I ever use my overlocker serger thingy-majigger here for is to encase raw edges like this, or flatline things, so I'm not too fussed about it. I don't really sew with knits, as we know. Like ever, pretty much. But I'll just go ahead and flatline all of my pieces like this on the serger. Okay, so now that I have my moire pieces flatlined, I can go ahead and mark my darts on those. Again, canine amongst you. Who's watching me close enough to notice when I mess up? I never marked the new dart points for these darts we added. So I need to come out 1 1/4 inch from the apex down into the center of those new darts as my dart points where they will end. Because again, if your darts go all the way to the apex, then you will have a very pointy apex. And if that's the look you're going for, then go for it, darling. But, I do wear a slightly pointier, more vintage style bra, which is the Bali brand flower bra. It's a good midway point between like an actual bullet bra and a more modern shape. It's kind of in the middle of those two things. It's more of like a 1980s sort of shape, leaning towards 50s and things. It's an old-fashioned style bra. It's actually very inexpensive usually too, which is nice. But so I do have a bit of a pointier bust shape that I have planned into my block patterns here. But I don't want the Madonna cone look, so I never make my darts all the way to the apex. Gotta end them about, I think the recommended is 3/4 of an inch away, but I end mine 1 1/4 inch because that's just what I've come to like with my double D situation personally. Alright, so now on the outside, the moire side, the finished outside bit of my fashion fabric, I'm going to mark my buttonholes that I planned earlier using this clover tracing paper. I've had this for forever. I don't know if it's still available, but I assume so. It's just like tailor's chalk coated paper. And then I'm using a little tracing wheel here to trace where my buttonholes need to be onto this garment. Just like vaguely, because you'll see in a moment here, there's another layer that gets the full buttonhole marked on it. I just want to make sure I'm eventually lining up those pieces I'm about to do in the correct place. So I'm just marking all 5 of my buttonholes here. Yippee! This is about to get rather fiddly. You'll see why I don't do these often. But I could use the practice, honestly, so that I can do nicer finishes like this more often. So with those buttonholes marked, I'm going to go ahead and start pinning the darts on this other piece that will eventually have buttons instead of buttonholes. So I'm pinning the 2 layers, because this is again flat lined, but it's like loose, you know? It's not like fused together with anything. So I'm pinning down the center of the darts first so that nothing moves around on me too much while I go ahead and pin these darts, and then set this piece aside next to the machine so I can sew these darts later. I will also go ahead and mark the darts on the back piece here as well. Again, just poking holes in my pattern with an awl, and then using those holes as a way to mark my darts onto my back pattern piece here, and then again, just tracing those lines in. I don't really mess around with darts. A lot of people don't even bother to mark them like this, and good for them, you know, but I like to see what I'm doing. I like to use a lot of pins. It's just how I do my sewing. Everyone has a different technique and different process. But I'm just, especially for something like this, it's going to be fully lined. No one will ever know that I used colored pencil, you know? You could use tailor's chalk if you wanted to. You could use some sort of a disappearing marker or ink or something like that. Something that washes away. But I'm just going to go ahead and use colored pencil. That's just me. Go ahead and pin these back darts, and again, set this aside next to the machine so that I'm ready to sew these little darts. Now for my peplum pieces here, I have my large wide back here because eventually it'll be pleated down, of course, and I can go ahead and pin the side seams, which would normally be like my A-line skirt side seams, but of course this is just, again, like my A-line skirt, but really short. Short enough that it is now a peplum instead of a skirt, you know? Like so, and again we'll set it aside. Now this magical fabric we have here is a 100% silk organza. So you may have seen like party organza before, polyester organza, but this is silk organza, the real deal. And the nice thing about silk is, despite it being like a lovely sheer fabric, in this case, or like a delicate looking fabric, it actually is quite strong. So silk organza is quite strong for what it looks like, compared to like say a chiffon. So it's nice, strong, crisp, like almost papery feeling silk fabric, but it is very thin and perfect for what I'm about to use it for, honestly. So I have a silk organza that matches my fabric perfectly. I'm cutting little rectangles of it, or squares of it, that are about 3 by 4 inches. Yeah, this is about 4 inches wide by 3 inches. And I'm going to draw my buttonholes in the center of these as well, because I'm about to sew these onto the right side of my fabric, where I marked my buttonholes, and then create little windows in my piece that will eventually become bound buttonholes. Hopefully this will all make sense within the fullness of time. Now again, bound buttonholes and, you know, more couture-ish finishes like this in general are not really my forte. I'm kind of just like an advanced home sewer, despite my training. So this is only the second time I've used bound buttonholes in a garment, so I'm going to be linking to a blog post from Laura May of Lilacs and Lace, an excellent seamstress and reproduction vintage seamstress as well, who has a really good blog full of lots of good tips and techniques, including how to do bound buttonholes the way I'm showing here, but, you know, probably in more detail, and you can see she's not using all black fabric like I am, so you can kind of see what she's doing a bit more. So feel free to click over to that blog post and check out her post on doing bound buttonholes like this, because I think it will be very helpful compared to my rambly nonsense. And here I'm discovering, you know what, maybe I'll make a sample one of these to show everyone what I'm talking about, and just because I probably could use a practice one. So I'm grabbing some of the moire, some of the cotton, and making a little sample jacket front here. So here is an exact same, you know, little situation just in a sample form. So I've drawn my buttonhole here. I'm going to line it up where I want on the right side of my fabric. Again, do not make the fatal mistake that I will later make in this video. Make sure you put the organza screen that will create your little window here in a minute on the outside of your fabric, so that when you turn it, you know, nicely, it will have the excess fabric on the inside. You don't want to mess that up. You'll see why later. And in some ways, it's good that I make a mistake later in this garment because you can see what not to do, you know? But here I am on my sample buttonhole. I'm going to sew the organza onto the outside, and I'm just sewing around that little box we drew. So here I am. I'm using a smaller stitch length for this also. You don't want to use like a big basting stitch length for this. You want something smaller that'll hold on because you're about to cut very small seam allowance on this little window here. So you want it to be tight, I suppose. Stitched well with a small stitch length. Yeah. And again, I'm just leaving the needle down, hooking the presser foot up, and then putting the needle back, or the presser foot back down after I've moved the fabric to where I need it to be, to get around the corners of stitching this little box. And the neater you stitch this little box, the nicer your buttonholes will come out. So having patience and being careful, you know, as always in sewing, usually pay off, but are not my strong suits, again. Alright, so I've stitched around the little box here. Go ahead and trim all my extra threads and such. So I've just got my little box stitched around, in this case where I have colored pencil. You can see from the other side, you can sort of see the stitching if you have this on your TV as opposed to on your phone. But I've just stitched around this box with a small stitch length, and now I need to cut into this little box. So I'm using a tiny pair of embroidery scissors to do this. And it's actually quite important the way you cut this. So I'm cutting down the center of the buttonhole here because you're going to need this seam allowance, so be careful. Cutting down the center here until I get to about the last 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to cut down into the corners, leaving myself a little triangle here. I can actually put on the screen a graphic here showing, you know, what it looks like. The red here is where I'm cutting. So you're leaving yourself these little triangles in the corners, and you need them. So make sure you cut these like this, I suppose. You know me, I'm all about do whatever way which works for you, but if you're going to use this method, you need to cut them like this. Alright, so now I have this buttonhole cut open, like so. I can go ahead and scrunch up this organza and stick it through the buttonhole itself onto the back. So I'm going to take this rectangle of organza, scrunch it up, and push it through the new buttonhole window we just made to the back. And doesn't this look just so lovely? You're thinking, oh no, what did I do wrong? No, it's all fine. Just go ahead and zhuzh this around in the back and pull everything to where it needs to be, and then give this a nice press with the iron here. That's what I'm going to do. Go iron it and come back. Should I have been doing this on the ironing board in general? Probably. But here I am. Here's my little window that I just created in the outside of my garment, or in this case, in this little sample square. So I'm going to go ahead and create all these little windows, and then I need to fill that in with little, like, buttonhole lips, basically. And so to do that, I've cut some little rectangles of fabric that are about 1 inch longer, a 1/2 inch on either side, longer than my buttonhole itself, and about, I don't know, 1 inch wide. I'm going to go ahead and iron those so you can get an idea of what I'm about to do here. Again, why didn't I just do this demonstration on the ironing board and set up the camera over there? I don't know. You know, I don't know. Anyway, so once those are folded in half, you can kind of get an idea of what's going to happen here. It'll be the two little, like, lips of my buttonhole that are going to sit on the inside of this window here. Like that. And then we have a bound buttonhole. You see what I'm saying? You see what we're going for? You've seen these on coats and such before. You know. But to make sure that these lips don't come apart and like they sit right next to one another, we're actually going to go ahead and use these flat and put a line of basting stitching down the center of this so that the lips of the buttonhole stay closed until we're all finished, and then we can remove this basting stitching. So I have this stitched together now, and I can go ahead and iron it open like a little butterfly, like this. So I press it like that, and again come back like this, and I can go ahead and position it so that the stitching line, the basted bits of it that are holding those two pieces together, is in the center of this little box. And then we have to do some very fun sewing to get them to stick there. Now, at this point, if you wanted to, you could just go in here and hand stitch inside the little window down to the like lips that we just created in there, and just hand slip stitch this down. And I think, and like I can visibly stitch it in there around the edge of this little window. And I think actually that might look even nicer than what I end up doing. Now, technically, the way to do this for this style of doing these is to sew them like I'm about to show you. And this is why you have to cut this very particularly with those little triangles and such, because you need that seam allowance to stitch these down into place. So I will show you the official method here, but oh man, I think I should have just done it by hand. Alright, so now, in order to get this all to stay together, you have to flip this back, and that little triangle you left from cutting that buttonhole open, I don't know if you can see it here, it's right here, there's a little triangle, see? Boop! You're going to sew that triangle down along this edge where you have it folded back. You're going to sew along here and sew that triangle down to the organza and the lip fabric underneath. I'm sorry I keep calling it lip fabric, but there's just no better name for it. You know what I mean. So over here on the machine, we're not sewing into that fold at all, we're just sewing that little triangle down. Again, I'm trying to demonstrate here on all black fabrics. If you want to see how this is done with a little bit more clarity, again, please check out the blog post that I will link to in the description of this video. So just sew that little triangle down to the other layers beneath it. Now I have to sew the triangle down on the other side. And then we will have to sew down the like trapezoidal shape of seam allowance that's like from making that window. Ugh. Again, this is so hard to explain. If you're following along at all right now, pat yourself on the back, honestly, because it's very easy to get lost here. So again, we've sewn our little triangles down on the short sides, and now we have to sew the seam allowance down on the long sides. This is like a tiny, tiny 1/8 of an inch wide seam allowance that I'm sewing down to the layers beneath here. So, you know, it is not the most fun thing ever. But I was trying to make this garment have a little bit of a nicer finish going on. And again, we will see how that works out for me in the end. Yikes! And the last side, the same thing here, sewing that seam allowance down to the layers underneath. Again, trying not to catch that fold where I have the fabric folded back. You want to sew exactly along the edge, but not catch that fold. Ugh. Have patience. More than I do. So here is my sample bound buttonhole. This is what it looks like on the back, so of course we're going to need a lining to cover all of this nonsense, which is where I will make my fatal mistake later. But now I can go ahead and take out the basting stitching that is holding the two lips of my buttonhole closed. So I'll go ahead and do that real fast here. Take out those basting stitches. Cut off any extra threads. And now here's my finished bound buttonhole. I'm thinking, oh, I should have brought a button over here so I could show them all how it works. So let me go find a button. There we are. You can see the camera shaking from me walking around. Here's my button. Let's see how this works. Ah, alas. It functions. Great news. And again, this sample buttonhole actually is probably the best one. Of the 6 I sewed, this one sample and the 5 on the garment itself, unfortunately this sample one is probably the nicest one. I need more practice with these. And doing it on like a slightly thick, slightly slippery poly moire like this, probably not the easiest thing to do ever. But alas. So eventually it will look like this once everything is sewn together. And of course this is just the sample one, so now I have to do 5 of these on the real deal. So here are my little pieces of organza lined up with where the buttonholes need to be on the outside of my garment here that I marked earlier. So we'll go ahead and stitch around all these little rectangles like so. Again, using a smaller stitch length for this, so that everything is held together nicely, especially when, you know, that seam allowance is so small when you turn these little organza squares to the other side, that you really want things to be firmly in place. Again, this is not the only way, or even considered the kind of like official way to do bound buttonholes. There are other methods, but I find the other methods, despite this having an extra layer of fabric, this organza is technically an extra layer compared to how many people do these. Because this fabric is so thin, I find that this comes out less bulky than any other way of doing these. Many years ago I made a plaid suit that you may have seen here on the channel sometimes. I have a green and like a black watch tartan suit that I made, and I did use bound buttonholes for that, and I tried different methods before I did those, and this is the method that I preferred the most out of trying different ways to do it. So This is just my preferred method. Of course, there are other ones out there. While there are some hard and fast rules in sewing, like I always say, clipping your curves is pretty darn important. But I believe in trying different methods and figuring out what works best for you in life. So here again is the cutting pattern for cutting these open. You're going to cut down the center of them and then triangles into the corners of the rectangles. So make sure you're cutting them like this so you have that seam allowance to work with once you get to the other side and are sewing the other portion of this whole thing down. So remember to cut them like this, and don't cut through your stitching. That is of course another risk here. You have to be careful and patient when stitching these and when slicing them open, honestly. Just cutting right up into the corners, but not through the threads. Be careful. And now, of course, I can turn all my little rectangles / squares of organza through the buttonholes to the other side. So I'll scrunch up all of these and stick them through the buttonholes. And then they will look really messy until I press everything. But at least I sewed them to the correct side here. Alright, so now I can start pressing those open. You can see I have created little windows in the front of my garment. Hooray! If you had like giant buttons, it's possible that you don't even need to add the lips portion of these bound buttonholes. If you just wanted windows like this, little like cutouts into your garment, this is a good way to do that as well. So now I have my bound buttonhole windows in the front of my garment, and I can go ahead and do all those little like weird lined up lip pieces inside. So I have all these little two pieces sewn together or basted together down the center with large stitches. So I can have my lips of my buttonholes stay closed until the very end when I'm going to open them up. You can see I just sewed those in a chain there real fast, and I'll give them a nice good press, line them up in those windows, and then do all those little steps, sewing down the tiny triangles, sewing down the trapezoid nonsense for every one of these buttonholes. And again, none of them come out as nice here on the garment as that one sample one did. Sometimes the lips come out like uneven, like one is thinner or thicker than the other because I don't get these perfectly centered underneath the windows. But, you know, practice makes better, so perhaps I should do bound buttonholes more often and then they will come out nicer. This is the lesson. But while I'm over here on the machine, to have a nice break from all that bound buttonhole nonsense, I can go ahead and sew the stuff that I pinned earlier. So the darts and the side seams for the peplum, which is what I'm sewing right here. Sewing the side seams of the front and back peplum together. Nice 1/2" seam allowance. None of this finagling layers of slippery stuff around tiny little buttonholes. Makes the rest of the sewing seem so easy, you know? In general, I do want to try and make sure I'm using linings when they are really necessary, using things like bound buttonholes over thread buttonholes when it makes sense, just trying to do a bit nicer finishes and make much more, I don't know, heirloom-worthy garments. I think everything I've made in the last couple of years will definitely last, or has lasted and hopefully will, but there's some things that I made many years ago that I didn't take the time to finish the seams, I didn't take the time to do nice finishes, and I regret that now. So I want to make things as nice as possible, because if I'm going to be making new things to enter the world, I'm hoping they will outlive me in some ways and become the vintage of the future, you know? So I'm trying to do things a bit extra nice from now on. We'll see how I do. I am an impatient human, as we know. So you can see all my buttonholes are done and messy on the inside here, but the lining will cover all that nonsense. It'll be between this outside layer and the lining layer, so you won't see any of that in the end. But I'm just pressing all my darts, making sure everything is playing nicely. Luckily this moire fabric wasn't getting any iron shine or anything. I had no problems with it at all. I wasn't turning the iron all the way up or anything because, of course, at some temperatures poly will melt eventually. I think this is actually a poly cotton blend. I don't know. I'd have to check on Mood's site. I don't quite remember. Alright, but now I can go ahead and sew my fronts onto my back at the shoulder seam and the side seam. So I'm going to go ahead and pin those two things together. Pin along that straight shoulder seam up here at the top of the frame, and then pin my side seams under the arm as well, down to the waist. And I can sew that for both sides. I am going to add in an extra little bit of stitching in that little curve under the arm as well, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Just going to use my 1/2 inch seam allowance as always and sew the shoulder seams and side seams together. It is actually quite difficult and expensive to find something like a proper silk moire, a watered silk as it is usually called. Sometimes you can find them for really fancy draperies, but it's not an easy fabric to find, so I usually settle for a polyester or acetate when I'm looking for moire fabrics, sadly. But I really do like moire, so I concede. Go ahead and press open my shoulder seams here, and of course I still don't have a clapper, so I'm using my darn hands again. I did ask for a clapper for Christmas, but no one obliged me, sadly enough. But one day I'll get a clapper. You know. So anyway, this little curve here under the arm, you do need to clip it, so I put in a little bit of extra stitching just along this curve, another line of stitching right on top of the original seam line, just to make sure this area is held secure, just for an extra bit of stability in here, because of course I do need to clip along this curve in order to press it open flat. And my scissors aren't quite up to the job with this thick fabrics. Alright. I'll use my tailor's ham as a clapper this time. Duh. Save my skin a little bit there. There we go. Works perfectly fine. Why didn't I think of that one before? And then I can go ahead and press the rest of this open flat as well. Now next up I'm going to start lining this garment, and I'm going to line the peplum and the bodice of this jacket separately. So here I am going to attach the lining to the peplum. So I'm going to kind of bag line this peplum, sort of. I'm going to go all the way around the front opening edges, which is down here where I'm pinning now. That's kind of the corner of the bottom front. And then all along the hem of the jacket itself, this curved edge down here is the bottom hem of the jacket. So I'm going to pin all along that and kind of just bag line the bottom of the peplum. So this is right sides together right now. And you can see this is the kind of dull grape colored Bemberg rayon lining I was talking about earlier. Just going to go ahead and pin all along the hem edge of the peplum here, and then up the other front edge on the other side. And I'll just sew this with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to do some understitching / edge stitching to make sure that this lining stays on the inside of my garment as well. Over here back on the machine, I am leaving myself a little bit of working room at the top of this, you can see. That's just because I wasn't exactly sure if what I was planning on doing was going to work, so I left myself a tiny bit of wiggle room up there where this will attach to the waist at the front, because I was like, is this going to work? But in the end, it worked out how I wanted to, so I could have sewn all the way to the top here, but whatever. Leave the needle down, turn the piece, put the presser foot back down, just how I like to sew around corners, you know? These are my ultra fine pins, so I have no problem sewing over them. The needle will win that argument. If a needle ever hits one of these pins, the pin will just bend. It's fine. Again, if you're new here, I do sew over my pins. It's just how I work. Of course, some people think it is, sacrilege. But that's, everyone must do what they feel is right and best for them, you know? Here I am doing some edge stitching, but it's like I'm trying to get as close as I can to the corner before I give up, because you can't get right in the corner when you're doing something like this. But what I'm doing here is I'm stitching the seam allowance down to the lining on the inside, so that when I press this, the fashion fabric kind of rolls onto the inside a tiny bit, and it just makes sure this line of stitching helps hold the lining inside the garment so that it isn't seen from the outside ever. It never droops below the hem or anything like that. Hopefully this makes some sense. I use the terms understitching and edge stitching usually interchangeably. Unfortunately, I could look up what the exact difference is, but I'm not going to. I highly recommend you do, And now with all that stitching finished, I can go ahead in here and press along here. Of course, I did have to clip this curve, because it is a curve, by the way. And I had to clip the corners at the bottom of the front of the jacket too. So always clip your corners and clip your curves. That is the one rule I never shut up about, And another kind of quirky thing I do here is that when I'm pressing things, usually while they're still hot, I will pin them like this. And so like while the fabric is returning to room temperature, it's pinned in place. I don't know if this really helps it set any more than just ironing it in the beginning, but just something I do and continue to do, honestly. So I just like to pin things while they cool. I figure if it works for my hair, it will work for my sewing. I'm just pinning this along the top edge. Because of the slightly rolled edge, the lining becomes a little bit longer here at the top than the fashion fabric. As you can see, it sticks out a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim that little bit of extra lining that's poking out of here. I'm going to trim that off, and then I'm going to baste along the top edge here. Eventually this waist is what I'm trimming right here. This is going to be the waist seam between this peplum skirt and the main body of the jacket. And it will be covered in a way I don't normally do, so I will show you that later. But for now, I'm just going to trim off the extra lining up here, and then you can see here I've just put a line of basting stitching about 1/4 of an inch down to hold that in place. Now I can go ahead and pleat the pleats for the back of this. So I've just marked them here with a little dot of colored pencil. I have the pleat here. It's going to be the center. So I'm just grabbing the edge of the pleat, folding it into the center here, and pinning it into place. So that's 2 inches on that side. These will be box pleats, and 2 inches on the other for 4 inches of fullness for each pleat total. And this, of course, helps the back of the jacket flare over whatever skirt I'm wearing, over my bum itself, over if you're wearing like a, more 18th century style skirt support underneath your skirt, you're going to want this bit of fullness that these pleats add so that this jacket will flare in the back. So here's one side of my pleat. I, of course, had to remove my pins that I had in there for while the fabric was cooling. Grab the other side of my pleat, bring it to the center, and we have our center back box pleat now. Like so, and I can go ahead and press that into place, and it will hold quite nicely in this fabric, which is nice. Now I can do these other pleats on the other side, mark the center of those, pull the sides in, and pin those in place, and press them, like so. Same sort of methodology for all the things. And I am pinning the bottom of the pleats shut a little bit here as well, just again to keep them from flapping around while I'm working on the rest of this jacket. So now I have my box pleats in the back of my peplum here, and the peplum is essentially finished, and I can sew it to the waist of my fashion fabric of the jacket here. So I haven't lined the bodice yet, but the peplum is all basically finished and lined. So I'm going to line up those darts with the box pleats, because that's how I had drafted it in the beginning. If you remember, I drafted those box pleats using the where the dart would be on the bodice as a guide, so it would look like those pleats are opening up from the darts themselves. So that's kind of the idea behind that. So I'll just make sure that everything is lined up properly. I will pin my side seams of the peplum to the side seams of the jacket and such, making sure everything lines up, and I'll pin everything together along the waist, and then I can sew everything together along the waist. And again, I didn't exactly know how I was finishing things down here, where the peplum and the jacket meet at the front, like underneath the buttons and buttonholes, but I worked it out in the end. Everything worked out like I was hoping it would, basically. So here I am sewing everything together at the waist, trying not to sew over my thick pins. So I'm ending about an inch before the end there. And I hadn't actually finished my bodice lining yet, so I better go over here and work on that. Just marking my darts onto the back piece for my lining here. I hate sewing darts in Bemberg rayon lining. Rayon lining like this is very soft and smooth and nice and silky to wear, but because it's nice and silky and watery and flowy, it's not very fun to sew with, because it's a slippery little bugger. So especially doing these like angled biasy darts in this fabric, not my favorite. But again, here I am trying to be good and line things nicely. Sorry if I'm a bit of a complainer. You have to force me to do nice finishes on things, you understand. I'm kind of a lazy seamstress, in reality. People always get mad at me when I say that, but it is my understanding of myself. Anyway, here I am using the same sort of chalk paper to transfer my buttonholes onto my lining as well, because of course I need more windows in my lining to line up with the buttonholes. But this is of course where I make my fatal mistake. And you can see here, this is where my darts are. This is the inside of my lining. And you are supposed to sew the little organza windows to the outside, the fashion fabric, the outside side of your garment and of your lining. So this here is the inside of the lining. It's what is going to be facing the fashion fabric in the end. Of course, the outsides face the outside, the insides face one another. So I should be pinning these onto the other side right now. I'm about to sew these organza squares onto the wrong side of the lining, and you'll see how that works out for me. If I had more of this lining fabric, I would have recut this piece and redone this once I noticed. Unfortunately, I don't notice that I've done this until after I've cut open these buttonholes. So the minute I cut like the last buttonhole, I was like, oh, I did these on the wrong side. Which was a sad moment for me. If I'm honest, actually, my sewing hasn't been, like, it's every project I've attempted this year so far, I've made some sort of mistake on. I don't know what kind of full moon Mercury retrograde weird nonsense is going on with me, but I keep making at least one mistake per project, and this time it was I sewed the windows into the wrong side of the lining for this project, and it would have been so nice and smooth and pretty finished inside if I hadn't have done this. But you'll see the Frankenstein fix I have to make on this to make it work. Again, I would have just cut a new piece of this lining if I had any more of this purple lining fabric around, but I didn't. And like, honestly, if I had noticed right now, before I cut the buttonholes, I could have taken off the organza and done it again on the correct side, but I don't notice until I cut them, so we all make mistakes. I do really like the way this jacket looks in the end, but of course the inside is not as pretty as the outside because of this mistake I'm making right now. There you go. There's me discovering, dang it, that I did this incorrectly. And so here I am pressing my little windows all nice. Even though the organza is going to show. Now this is what it should look like on the inside of my garment. But really, if I put, so it should, it should be nice like this with the windows. But I did them on the wrong, do you see what I'm saying? It's like mirrored, it's on the wrong side. So once this is sewn together, it will look like this, which is not what you want. You want the organza to be sandwiched in between. And so I'm thinking, okay, I guess I can hem these organza boxes so at least the edges aren't raw. That's what I'm gonna have to do. All right, well, oh, bummer. I could have cut a different lining for this, but as much as I wanted this to be nice, I didn't want to have to recut my entire bodice lining, so here I'm just going to hem my little organza squares that shouldn't have to show. I do hope you understand what I mean by this. Like if I had sewn these organza squares on the other side, then I would just have nice finished windows around my buttonholes, but instead, here I am hemming these squares. This is why when people are like, why don't you make an insert really fancy thing here? I'm like, oh guys, I'm not actually qualified. I'm not, I think I fooled people into thinking I'm a good seamstress, honestly. But here I am making a fatal mistake, 15 years into sewing. Longer than that. I've been sewing for like 18 years. But, doesn't mean you can't mess up. So it'll look like this in the end. Le bummer. Alright, let me sew my front and backs of my lining together here. Again, using this nice slippery fabric. It is a pretty color though. I like this kind of grayed out, quartzy, amethysty, sort of purple kind of lining. It's a pretty color. Again, it's been in my stash for ages. I think I bought this to line a black dress and then just didn't have the heart to line it with something that wasn't black and eventually bought black lining. And therefore this purple has been kicking around for forever. Go ahead and sew those side seams and shoulder seams very quickly over here. I can't sew at 800 times speed in reality, unfortunately, but I can speed myself up to 800 times speed here in Premiere. And now I'm going to go ahead and basically kind of bag line the bodice of this. Again, the peplum is now attached at the waist, and I'm going to leave the waist open, but I'm going to sew the lining all down. This is the front, the non-buttonhole side. This is the button side of the front. So I'm going to sew down this front opening here, all along the V-neck, all along the back of the neckline. This is with the lining and the fashion fabric right sides together. And then I can clip my corners and curves and turn this right side out. And again, I will do as much edge stitching / understitching as I can around this edge, getting as close to the corners as I can, basically, so that all this rolls under and lays nicely along the neckline. But I'm just using, again, my silk pins here so that I can sew over them. You know me and my naughty habits of sewing over pins. I'm just gonna, I'm never gonna do March, if anyone's wondering. In life, I have no plans to ever do that. But it would be yes, I sew over pins. Maybe I could do like a mug that says, yes, I sew over pins. It is the motto of my life. People are always questioning me on it, but you're not going to stop me, I'm sorry. And then here's the buttonhole side. And you can see this is what it should look like. If you had done it correctly, this is what it should look like in the finished bit. But of course, I'm putting right sides together right now, so when I turn this out, my little squares of organza will be on the outside. So annoying. Helping just guide this through the machine as I go all around the fronts, the neckline, and the back neckline as well. Again, just leaving the needle down where I come to a point, lifting the presser foot to turn out a little bit, put the presser foot back down, just so I can get around my corners cleanly. Now again, I can go ahead and clip my corners and my curves here before I try and turn this right side out. So this is kind of an obtuse corner up here, but I'm going to cut it anyway. And then I'll take snips into the curvy bits of my neckline in the back here, just so that everything will lie nice and smooth once I turn this right side out. There we are. So now I'm going to do my understitching / edge stitching here. Again, sewing the seam allowance down to the lining side of this, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam itself. Hopefully that makes some sense. I think it counts as edge stitching when you're doing it like this. Again, it would take me 2 seconds to look up this information. But, you know, if we're learning anything today, it's that I'm not the most professional of humans. So, alas, please forgive me. Anyway, starting from the other side now. Stitching all the way along, stitching that seam allowance down to the purple side here. So all the seam allowance is facing the lining as I'm going along here, which will just make everything lie smoother. You have to make sure you clip your curves and corners before you do this, by the way. Must. Order of operations nonsense. You must cut your corners, clip your corners and curves before you do your edge stitching like this. Now I can go ahead and press everything into place. And what I'm going to do here is basically I'm pressing all the seam allowance from sewing the peplum on at the waist up into the main body of the garment. I'm folding the raw edge of the lining of the bodice under a 1/2 inch and then pinning it down over the waist seam. So I'm going to pin this in place here, and that will perfectly cover everything. And I can stitch this down by hand in here, slip stitch the lining to the lining, and it will be perfectly smoothly lined with no stitching showing on the outside, and technically no stitching showing on the inside if you slip stitch it like I'm about to. I can go ahead and press around my outside edges as well here, kind of switching back and forth between doing the waistline and doing the neckline and front edge. Apparently I was distracted. Here I am pressing that neckline, the back neckline here. Alright, and so, unfortunately, those little squares of organza are going to show. and it means that this is extra fiddly right here at this buttonhole that's really close to the waistline. Again, it's nice to have a buttonhole close to the waistline because that's where a lot of the tension in the garment is held, of course, because that's the tightest part of the garment for me, usually, because everything I make is hourglassy shaped. But means like I have a lot to finagle in here, and fold over and play nicely, unfortunately. But you can see again, I'm putting the seam allowance up into the main body of the garment, turning the 1/2 inch of the bodice lining under, and then pinning it down over the waist seam. I'm just going to trim it a little bit right there because it's just got too much to hide going in here. But I fought it, and I mostly won. It wasn't a best case scenario, but it will work. Again, I'm sorry if I sound at all a little bit down about this. Really, I'm quite happy with how this garment turned out. It's just I'm disappointed that I did this part wrong. Anyway, imagine that these windows don't have this, black border around them. Imagine that you had done it on the correct side and it was nice and smooth. You just want to pin the windows of your lining around the openings for your buttonholes, and then you'll have to hand stitch around the windows. Of course, I'll have to hand stitch around the windows and around the window border. The molding of my window, as it were, that is not supposed to be there. Sad times. Again, just finishing the lining at the waistline here, just along the back here where the pleats are. This is how you can line something like this. It almost looks like a bag lining, but I had to do the peplum and the body separately, both because of the buttonhole situation and because of the back pleats. I wanted them to be lined nicely like this too. So here I have the peplum in the top half of the screen and the body of the garment in the lower half of the screen, but I'm just taking I'm slip stitching the two together. So I'm taking a little bite, like a stitch out of the fold here of the lining for the top, and then I'm going to take a stitch into the lining of the peplum. Again, I'm not taking any stitches into the actual fashion fabric layer, I'm just stitching through the lining layers, stitching the lining to itself all along the waist here so that it has an invisible finish and looks all like one piece. Just all along the waist that same way. Then I can go ahead and slip stitch the sleeve hems as well. So I again have these turned a 1/2 inch each towards the inside. I have the lining turned a little bit more so that again it rolls towards the inside and the lining isn't visible. With an open-ish sleeve like this, it's a little bit visible, which is why I chose pretty purple lining. But for the most part, it is invisible, especially since I am going to slip stitch this as well. You'll see me finish sleeves, all-in-one sleeves like this a lot. Quite often on my channel, I use this finish for these kind of things, like my wrap tops and things, when I've been fully lining them. Just put on a podcast, watch someone building a cool house in The Sims, something like that in the background. That's what I'm probably doing. And slip stitch all around my sleeves. Alright, and so now I have to finagle this. So you can see what I've done here is I've felled down most of the black window nonsense, and then I've also felled down the edge of the windows around the buttonholes themselves on the inside here. Again, none of this is visible on the outside, thank goodness, because what a mess. But I can go ahead and take the basting stitching out of my lips of my bound buttonholes now. That's what I'm doing here, just taking that basting stitching out so that I have a functioning buttonhole. You want them to function. That is the primary purpose of these things. So my buttonholes will work. That's always good. But unfortunately the lining I did backwards. So the outside will look okay, but the inside will always look like Frankenstein's monster. Ah! That's what I'm thinking here. Yeah, truth. But I'll show you how I was felling these down. Again, I could have slip stitched this too, but at this point I was just like, it's always going to look bad anyway, whatever. So I've just felled them down. Then I just need to stitch down the window opening around the buttonhole as well. This is the only step you would have here if you had done the windows on the correct side. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm just felling down this to the back of the lips of the buttonhole. And again, you shouldn't have these black borders around here because it should be on the inside in between the layers of the fabric. But alas, I did for this one. But at least now all I have to do is sew the buttons onto this and this jacket will be finished. And here is my finished black moire version of this little jackety vest thing. It's sort of like a top, it's sort of like a jacket, it's sort of like a vest, it's sort of, you know, I don't know what lives in the middle of those triangle points, but this, I guess, it's a little too sleeveless, I think, to call it a jacket properly, but short-sleeved evening jacket top thing? Exactly. So here it is with the matching moire skirt from my closet, but of course I can also wear this in the same way that I wore the yellow one with a pleated skirt and my 18th century panniers underneath. Again, panniers look like this. This is like a drawing of them. Mine are really, really shoddy and from when I was 16, so I won't bother showing you mine. But like the little basket hoops that you wear tied onto your hips that hold the skirt out in a more 18th century shape, so the outfit looks like this in result. Really, the most 18th century quote-unquote thing about this ensemble, either this one or the yellow one, is the panniers holding out the skirt. So that's what's giving it this more history-bounding kind of effect. So really you just need pocket hoops and pleated skirts to have this sort of effect, not a jacket like this one. But I do hope you enjoyed seeing how this little garment came together. I had a lot of requests for this one, so I knew I wanted to make another one, especially since I wasn't going to be keeping the gold one. I wanted to make something that would fit into my own wardrobe a little bit better, and I think black moire is the answer. And yes, I did cut my own hair this last week in the middle of this video, so, you know, no more victory rolls for a little while now. I'll have to grow it back out to that length, but seeing as lockdown is never ending, it shouldn't be long now. Thank you all as always for tuning in today, and I will see you again for another project real soon. Bye.